there is no going back to normal, and anyone in a church that thinks that's the way to go is going to be lost. The good news is there's never been a greater need, nor is there a better answer to the needs than Christ and the church.
Welcome to World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us as we help Christian leaders build faith-sharing movements around the world. Visit our website, worldmethodist.org, to learn more of the ways that we train, gather, and resource Christ followers within the global Wesleyan family as they become agents of transformation by sharing the gospel through the power of the Holy Spirit. I'm your host, Rob Haynes. Happy New Year. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the generosity of Christ Church Memphis for making this podcast possible. Today's episode is about the post-COVID church. Stewart Kellogg, who is an author, a businessman, a television producer and manager, he has spent a career in many different facets of the business world while also faithfully serving his church. He's done some work to help us look into the future of what the church can do now that we are on this phase of the pandemic. Stewart, welcome to the Real Faith, Real World podcast.
Thank you so much, Rob. Appreciate being here and talking to your folks.
Really excited to hear what you've learned as you've written more and learned more about the post-COVID church. But first, help us get to know you a little bit.
Well, thanks. I am a New Yorker who moved from upstate New York to Mobile, Alabama after I graduated.
That must be a story.
Yes, I just, I was tired of the cold and wanted something different. And later my family said they couldn't believe I did it, but I had a job and in television. I started in television while I was in school. I was the weatherman while I was going to school at Syracuse, and then moved to Mobile and was on air, and then moved into news management, moved quite a while, and spent my last 25 years running a TV station for the Hearst Corporation, the ABC station in Jackson, Mississippi. And during that time, went to seminary.
How about that?
So for Wesley Biblical Seminary.
So you have somebody with a Wesleyan background, but worked in media. So you've never really been on a church staff or something like that, but you serve in ministry in different ways through those years, right?
I have, yeah, and really enjoyed it. And one of the things I did after seminary was I got to study under Chuck Colson. It's now called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and it was about worldview, something that was so new, that whole idea. But also started a prison ministry in Jackson. Also did a lot of teaching. I love teaching and different ministry work on boards, and I did lay leadership within a church, but no, never on staff.
Well, I just think it's great that we don't necessarily have to be a paid professional staff member in order to serve in some wonderful ministry ways.
Well, and that's one of the themes that comes out of this book, and that's come out because of the pandemic. I know we'll get into that in a bit, but that whole idea of, I call it the talent in the pews, how often it is overlooked.
Indeed, because sometimes we think, it's just the preachers or the ones who are on the church staff that should be doing that work. But one of the things I love about the Wesleyan movement is that the lay people, the people, like you said, the talent in the pews, were empowered. John Wesley kind of turned that whole thing upside down, that it was just the appointed priests who were the ones that were teaching and preaching.
And I don't think that's happening, especially in the Western church. I think from both ends. I think part of it is we're staff, we're paid to do this, don't get in our business. And part of it is we're paying the salaries, you do the work, we're here to be entertained. I think it does. I think it runs both ways. I'll tell a quick story in a without naming the church, but in a Methodist church in Georgia when we were there. I was fairly new, newly retired as well, excited in a new area to share, and so I was sharing with the pastor my background and willingness to help. And a little bit later, there were some personnel issues that come up. Surprise, surprise, in a church. And I went to him, and I had just met this new fella in our Sunday school class. I said, Pastor, do you realize that the retired head of human resources worldwide for Union Carbide is in our Sunday school class? I said, do you think he might be able to help? And he was fascinated. Give me the information. Never called him. And I've talked to some others who said, some of that is a fear, I guess, a little intimidation or whatever, however that works. Greg Ligon in the book, I mentioned that, and he said the sweet spot is between the pastor willing to give something up and this executive or leader willing to slow down a little bit. Yeah. He realizes it's not a business. He said that's that sweet spot.
Yeah, so let's talk about the book, and that's a really great way to lead into that. You came to buy the material for this book in a little bit of a non-traditional manner. I love that story. Tell us how you came to gather all of the information for this.
I came in backwards.
Yeah.
Book. And so it started in spring of 2020, right? We all remember what was going on, actually late winter. Things were shutting down, and I just saw what some churches were doing. I called it turtle churches, and hunkering down, and including the one that I went to. And I was out there sharing ideas. Hey, this is opportunity, and just nothing. Whereas seeing some other churches were leaning in and saying, as Bill Wilson, I quote in the Center for Healthy Churches, what a great time to pastor a church. This is the time. And I saw this dichotomy, and so I wrote a column. I had examples of, if you will, the bad and the good, and what the church needs to do. And I was working in the yard thinking, how can I get this published? And I thought of a fellow named Joe Stradinger, who is very much into social media, happens to live in Mississippi. Edge Theory is his company. I hadn't talked to him in 5 years. And I texted him while I was working in the yard and told him what I was doing. He texted right back and said, let's talk today at 5 o'clock. And I talked to him, and he said, the article's fine. You'll print it somewhere, a paper will take it, and then nobody will remember. He said, you got to do social media. And I was not into it, so we set up the Facebook group, and then a podcast, and then a website, an app, and it just grew, looking at, again, especially the positive, what creative things were going on, and what the challenges would be, and then looking at some of the data of what was going on. And about a year into it, my wife said, you've got all this material. I ended up talking to about 100 folks, and she said, why don't you put it in a book? And it took a couple months, and then I said, yeah, let's do that. So then I've compiled and added to it, and the book came out last fall.
So as you were gathering all of that information, it wasn't necessarily with the idea of a book when you started out, but just trying to immediately respond to what was going on around you. So is that right?
Yes, and the whole idea is, the mission statement helping the church share more of the good news in the face of hostility, persecution, and disinterest. And wow. So the idea was, hey, how can this help the church?
Sure. So you mentioned 100 people or so that you contacted. Tell us about some of the most memorable of those conversations, or the ones that kind of float to the top of the list of interest of people.
Well, and some are well known. Jim Dennison is a very well known blogger and podcaster. Greg Kokel, who does a lot in the ministry work. George Barna, probably the best known researcher. So some of these folks who are gracious enough to come on the podcast, talk about John Stonestreet from the Colson Center. And then so I had, if you will, the experts. I had pastors, small and large churches, folks. I mentioned Greg Ligon, who has been a pastor and now helps pastors in leadership. So it was a real mix of those who were doing things. And it was interesting because my thinking was from a couple of places. One was, what are some basic things I can do? And then what are some off the wall? So, for example, I talked to a fellow who, Chip Henderson, who's a pastor of a 6-site megachurch, 10,000 in Mississippi. Okay, I've known him for a while. Well, the example in the book that you'll see is, he said from the beginning, we're calling every member. And here, a friend of mine shared me. He goes, I'm a member. He said, I get a call from the past, how simple that is. And I talked to Chip. He said, well, we started with the single moms and the elderly. Yeah. And the staff, we broke it up, and the lay people, and we were constantly contacting. And I thought, how many never got contacted? So that was basic. Then there was a fella named Rusty Rayburn in West Columbia, South Carolina, 185-person church, Grace Chapel. Happened to have somebody on his staff who was a retired engineer who said, I can get the equipment and make a radio station.
Wow, a radio station.
Because we've got the elderly who are not ready to come back in.
Right.
So they built with equipment they borrowed and found, and it was a 1-mile radius little station. And so the elderly, a couple of them could get it at their homes, and others would come into the parking lot and sit and listen because they weren't comfortable going in. Anyway, it was just this creative, but Rusty had empowered his folks to say, come to me with ideas.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting that you were able to pull from a wide audience, not just the ones that get all of the name
right.
recognition, but also those who are doing wonderful work that may be just to a smaller constituency.
And one of my favorite, and it's a larger church in Chesapeake, Maryland, and Robert Hahn is the pastor. And a friend of a friend, that's how I would connect. Hey, you've got to talk. Well, I talked to Robert. He has a sign that says, if you won't serve, you won't be happy here.
Oh, wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
Right up front. And he said, look, of course they can come. He said, you will be uncomfortable because it's expected. Well, that shouldn't be pandemic. That's kind of biblical.
Yeah.
But here's the I said, that's just how we roll.
Right. Right.
And then there's an example in the book of what they did to help the needy kids who are no longer in school getting their free lunches. How he empowered and used deputy sheriffs who weren't in the schools either to deliver the meals. As he said, to doors they used to kick down. Now they're knocking and giving meals to the kids. Anyway, just some basic things. And as he said, these ideas, a lot of them came from the pews, not necessarily from the top.
That's great. Well, so let's get into a little bit of the material that you learned along the way and have published in the book, The Post-COVID Church. Stewart, here it is, the start of 2022. I think last year, many of us thought if we can get past 2020, and then 2021 didn't look a whole lot better in a lot of parts of the world, but here we are at 2022 and very hopeful as to what's ahead. And I think sometimes people want to rush back to the way things were back in 2019 or the start of 2020. But you say there is no getting back to normal. Talk about that some more. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, and that flows out of the idea, as I said, the turtle churches. Let's hunker down. Let's just get through this, and then everything will be okay.
Yeah.
And we saw early on, and this is 3 months in, and this is the Barna Research Company, as it looked, a third of church members had dropped out, not just in person, but also online, a third. And what it has done is simply accelerated what was going on. I mean, you were lying to yourself if you're in the quote church business and thought things were hunky-dory, because even for the most orthodox, we know what's happened to the mainline denominations and all those issues.
Right.
But even in the more orthodox, I mean, Southern Baptists have lost 2 million members in the last few years. Can't remember the exact number. So the idea was losing members, losing influence. The culture was changing. We're up to almost 1 in 4 Americans with no religious affiliation. So all these things were happening, so there wasn't much of a great normal to return to. But so this has accelerated what was already going on, what was already going to make it tougher. But also, my belief is what also is going to be the biggest opportunity, because this, quote, new world is not the new normal, the new world, probably going to be a smaller church, but boy, more need than ever. And an opportunity to change what we're doing, to stop and say, why are we doing this instead of this?
Yeah. I think that's difficult for some church members to think about, or people who were maybe just interested in faith, in realizing that the pandemic has just accelerated that which was already going to happen. And I think there's also a little bit of I can stay home and consume media. I mean, we've been streaming, for years now, but even more so through the pandemic when we couldn't get out and about or didn't want to go to cinemas or whatever. But now that I think that spills over into church. I can stay home on Sunday morning. I can make my own breakfast. I can sit on my couch with my own coffee and my pajamas and listen to the sermon and get something out of it. But that's not enough as far as church goes, is it?
That's not biblical as far as what we are to be the body, right?
So then, how could leadership, you say in the book, run towards the roar? What do you mean by that?
John Robertson gave me that term, and he's a former pastor in Canada and helps. This whole idea, he uses the analogy of the hunting party. And if you're a hunting party, you're looking for the meat to bring back, right?
Sure.
And the idea is you have to run towards the roar. That's where what you're searching for is as a hunter, rather than running from it. And so we've got to run toward. That's where the church is needed. That's what we need to not be afraid of, if you will. And that's so much of this book and so much of what goes on in the church. It is leadership. It starts from the top. It sets the tone. And it is not a business in that sense, but it is an organizational structure. And if you don't have a good organizational structure, well, that's your organizational structure, and you're not going to serve the folks.
So when you say the roar, do you mean how do I get those folks that were coming to church before? How do I just get them back? Or is it evangelizing new communities, mission service? What's roaring, Stewart?
I guess a lot of it comes down to, and this is one of these opportunities to focus, is say, all right, what is the call of the church? What is the Great Commission, right? And so what are we called to do? To make disciples. As George Barna says, we're not necessarily measuring the right things. What's our attendance? What's our square footage? How many programs?
Sure.
He said, no, the one thing should be how many lives are being transformed?
Right.
And what are you doing discipleship one-on-one? And so do you stop and say, that's the roar, if you will, that's the need, that's what we need to be doing. Do you stop and say, this is how I believe it should be done as you reorganize, and say whether it's a program or what we're doing as a church, does it help make disciples?
Yeah.
And I think if it doesn't, then you should have a real hard conversation. Well, should we do it? I mean, that's a real focus. And I think this is the time where you're going to focus. And that's who's your staff? How are you using the staff? What are you doing?
If it doesn't make disciples, then should we be doing it?
That's a hard question. Kelly Canwisher from Future Company, she's someone I spoke to who's has her MDiv and is very involved in ministry, but also now helps consult churches. And her key point that I talk about in the book, she said so much of the church is all focused on Sunday morning. Right. And so you're spending 6 days and she said, that's not right. We can't. And so this has changed because all of a sudden there was no Sunday morning for people there.
Right.
Right. It was streamed. So this has helped that way. But she said it can't be. And this goes back to the point, is it all a show that we're showing, or are there needs during the week that we can do?
And I think you're absolutely right. I think of a time when I was in youth ministry early on, and parents would come to me, and basically it was a lot of times, just fix my kid. There's this problem going on in my teen's life, and if the church will just fix it, it'll be great. And it was meant well, and really wanted the best for their child. But I would ask, okay, I said, if your kid is here every time we're offering something, how many hours a week would they be here? And they say, well, maybe 4 or 5, Sunday morning, Sunday school, Sunday night youth, Wednesday night Bible study, whatever that may be, maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours a week. I said, you have your child that many hours every single night between the time school gets out and they go to bed. So let's talk about how we as a family can disciple you and your family and how you can lead your child. And that turns it upside down from this programming sort of thing, to work with the teens. That's right. You fix the teens, you fix the kids, you fix the adults. but instead discipleship of whatever that family may look like as a single person or somebody with children. And I think that's something we're going to have to learn again in a post-pandemic church.
Yes, and there's an example that I speak to, Corey Miller, and Corey is CEO of Ratio Christi, which the whole purpose is they have groups on college campuses of Christians, and the idea is it's really a Christian worldview. And they set up debates with atheists and that sort of thing, but also they do the worldview education. And he said one of the keys is so the kids in your case in that church, then they graduate, and then they go to Michigan State University and sit in a philosophy professor's class for one day, and their world is blowing up, and they don't know how to defend the faith.
Right.
And Corey's term was, he said, all these churches spend too much time, these pastors with skinny jeans and fog machines, as he called it, instead of preparing the kids, not just in the Bible, but how to defend the Bible.
Yeah, and you can wear skinny jeans and teach the Bible. Great.
Yeah, his point was they weren't. They're entertaining,
right?
And rather than getting into the hard stuff, and by the time again you're sitting in that philosophy class, it's hard.
And your book also takes some time to focus on apologetics in the next phase of the church. What did you learn?
It is. I love apologetics, and part of the Christian worldview is I learned that in the Colson Center, and then through it, I love being able to. I don't like to use the term debate, and Chuck Colson used to use the term winsome all the time. We've got to be winsome. We have to be attractive. We can't be bashing people on the heads.
Right.
But to be able to have those basic conversations, whether it's talking about science or talking about why faith is reasonable or why belief in God is reasonable. But just being able to have that ability to have that conversation, not necessarily a debate, but to have that conversation on why it makes sense. And this goes, again, if you say to someone who doesn't believe, well, I believe this because it's in the Bible, and they said, that's fine for you. I don't believe in the Bible. And there's got to be more than that. In other words, it's opening up, I believe, that's the other side of it, deep down, but you're not going to get that out in public. You're going to get it one-on-one as you're having coffee and talking about what life is like. And that's, again, where that relationship comes and being able to explain the faith and what it means. And unfortunately, and I go into this, everything's so politicized now, talking about America, but we've got it in other places as well, of course. And the church is in the middle of it, and that's somehow, in some way, obviously harming the witness, because we got to get beyond that.
So I wonder how we can continue to have those coffee conversations when we may not be able to get out of the house. Or, I think everyone's thinking, are we going to have another round of need to quarantine or something like that? Because there's a lot of uncertainty in science and the feeling of what leaders will do. So how can we even set ourselves up now so that we can continue to have those one-on-one conversations with other folks? I
think it's making it intentional. And I think it's, for example, and again, let's assume we're not going to total shutdown, which would delay it or make you go back online. But I think the churches that openly say, what are these questions? A lot of folks don't want the kids to have questions. That means you don't believe. No, they're having questions. To encourage that, and to even encourage engagement with those who question, within the community and that sort of thing. Being intentional in a similar way. And one of the action steps that I talk about, we know the racial issue. We've got that's America, right? That's the world, but that's America's. We've got so many racial issues, but in Christ, we have the best answer, but you've got to get through a lot of weeds to get to the core. Well, that can only happen if you really know someone. So I still think, and again, most churches are not truly integrated. So where's it come from? From the pastors at different churches. And not to do any big, but maybe just sitting down, maybe just 12 leaders from the black church or this white church, just sit down, let's talk about stuff with no agenda. And then why don't we go do something to get, those sorts of intentional pieces. And again, the world looks and says, something's going on there. Something's a little different. It doesn't fit my stereotype of this Christian.
Stewart, I think it's important to point out that This book is for churches of all denominations, but you do come at things from a Wesleyan Methodist perspective. Can you talk a little bit about how you got connected with Methodist theology as someone who, was exposed to the Methodist Church even before a formal education? But then how did you get into that in terms of your own study? And then how has it impacted your work in this book and as someone who is a lay leader in your church?
Before I went to seminary, Dr. Matt Friedman, who's still a professor at Wesley, he had done some work in TV, so we knew each other. I said, I'm a Methodist, but I don't know about this Wesley guy. He brought me about 6 books. Well, my favorite, it's out of print, but is England Before and After Wesley. Yeah. It was written in 1938. It just opened my eyes. You talk about the gin, cheap gin, and what that had done. You talked about the corrupt church. Everything, and what this culture was, and what this movement did to change the culture. It's amazing. And you'll correct me on the numbers, but I think it's by about 1848, I believe, 1 out of 3 churchgoers in America was a Methodist. From 1% at 1776, so it impacted it.
Right, and back to your discussion about the political parties a little bit. It was Ulysses Grant. He said there were 3 parties in America. There were the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Methodists, because the Methodist movement was the most influential organization outside the United States government in the mid-19th century in the United States, and so. I wonder what we could do to recapture that. I think we could go back to what was being preached and taught and the methods of that, and just what you're talking about, evangelism and discipleship at the core, rather than how can we just keep the doors open to this local church or this particular entity or organization alive. And that's what you finish with in the book is surviving is different than thriving.
Right, yes.
Can you explain what you mean by that a little bit?
It just came to me kind of early. Not that I made up the phrase, we've used it. I just loved how the church needs to do more than just survive. It needs to thrive. And so it's got that opportunity. No one I spoke to thought the church is going to be larger. Nor was it going to be anyway. We were on the trajectory. That's accelerated. But I also, most of the people, and I can maybe say all the people I talked to, was optimistic in the sense that, number one, as Chuck Colson used to tell us, we know how the story ends.
Yeah.
That's the good news.
I've read the end of the book. I know who wins.
That's the good news.
Yeah.
And secondly, this idea that, we may be a smaller church, but what an opportunity to have more power. Yes, we're going to face, look with the Equity Act. I mean, we're going to face fewer protections. We're very protected in America. That's going to go away. It's going to be a little harder to be. It already is to stand up for some foundational biblical beliefs in the workplace, or that's going to be different. But the thinking is the church itself will have more impact on the culture, which needs it more than ever. Doesn't know it right now, perhaps, but needs it more than ever, especially the young. That's just that yawning need. And so, okay, then how can we do this? And we can't do it the way we did it before. We've got to rethink. And it starts at the top, but also just stepping back. One of the fellows I talked to, Randy Russ, who has been interesting. He was CEO of Community Coffee. He was a teacher at a Christian university in Jackson State University and an executive pastor. So he's got all these hats on. And he said, look, what happens in a recession, any company, you have to stop, you have to restructure, because if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to go out of business. And so looking at the same way, this is a perfect opportunity for the church to stop, look at what we're doing. Who do we have on staff? Why is the staff this size? What is the staff doing? How can we use the talent in the pews? But it takes a real forward-thinking way to rethink. But again, the need is even greater out there. That's the great news, and who else can solve the problem than Christ and the church?
That's right. And I love the idea of thriving over just surviving. Frequently, I talk to folks who are in smaller churches, and they want to know, what can we do to get young people in our church? And that idea is the church, everyone in the church is older. And if we just get some children here, we can keep our doors open a little bit longer. And while I appreciate that sentiment and the local church is important, I think people see through that whole idea of you're just asking them to come so that, they can one day be givers and keep paying the light bill. They want to know, do you have something for me? Can you help me raise my kids? Can you help me get through this crisis that I have in my family? Can you help me find my way as I'm going to college or I'm going to start a career or whatever that may be? And as you mentioned, the Bible has all of those answers, and we need to show folks that it's more than just preserving an institution, but it's actually about being on mission.
And making a difference and touching the lives, absolutely.
And making a difference and touching lives, absolutely. And that's the whole message of the thing that we have to share, is that Christ is calling you unto himself and wants to make a difference in that life.
It's kind of biblical.
Yeah, absolutely. So if someone were to ask you, why should I read the Post-COVID Church? I'm not a pastor. How would you answer them?
And the whole idea, yes, I think it will be useful for pastors and lay leaders, but I think for the general church-going public to get, and I give a little history there of kind of where we've come as a culture background. And I think there'll just be ideas that if you are someone in a church and all you're doing is going there to be entertained, then don't bother. $9.95 won't be well spent. But if you're in a church and you do want to get engaged, you know that you're called to do something, I think this will give great ideas and thoughts and a challenge to those in the faith, what we can do on the other side. Again, we're not returning to normal, but we will get this pandemic behind us. I happen to believe COVID's going to be running around a long time, but we're going to be able to live with it as we do with other things. But now, where's the church going forward? And again, it can't be led by the staff. It's got to be this whole body of Christ, and I think there's a lot of examples and opportunities and challenges in there for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. The book is The Post-COVID Church, and the author is Stewart Kellogg. Stewart, if people wanted to reach you or learn more about this project, what's the best way?
Well, there is a website, thepostcovidchurch.com. Also, an email, Stewart, and that's Stuart, that's spelled the correct way, Stuart, at thepostcovidchurch.org. That's the email. Facebook group, The Post-COVID Church, and if you want to join, just go on there and ask, and I'll let you on. And those are opportunities and ways to see what we're doing and to get in touch. And the book is available on Amazon, either in Kindle portion, ebook format, or paperback.
Excellent. But before I let you go, Stewart, I'd love to ask my guest what you found. This could be a book, a podcast. It could be maybe an album or something like that you've discovered. So, Stewart Kellogg, what have you found?
I think one of the things I love reading every day is Breakpoint. And Breakpoint, John Stonestreet, who's part of the Colson Center, he's got a podcast as well. But Breakpoint, it just does such a wonderful job. And again, I love apologetics and the idea of how we defend the faith and how our faith interacts with culture. And I think that's a great tool for folks to learn more about the faith and how to put it in action.
That is an excellent resource. I know that I've listened to Breakpoint on the radio and also have read it as well, and that is an excellent resource. Thank you.
And John Stonestreet was also, he was kind enough to be on the podcast, and he's part of the book as well.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to have a companion that you should use with Post-COVID Church, and that's a book called Future Church, 7 Laws of Real Church Growth. And that's by Will Mancini, and it's an excellent work as well. And
I mentioned Kelly Canwisher earlier. She and Will are partners, and that was part of the book that came out, and she was a podcast guest as well.
See,
so all tied together.
As I said, these are companion books. Well, thank you, Stewart, for all the richness that you brought to the conversation, and I look forward to our listeners checking out more about the Post-COVID Church. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob.
What a great way to start our new year. I know many of us are looking for 2022 to be different than what we've been through with the pandemic and in so many ways of the church. I really appreciate Stewart and all that he brings in his richness, not only of his education, but also his experience, both in business and in the church. You'll find links to everything we talked about in today's show notes. May I ask a favor? Would you take just a minute here in the new year to rate and subscribe if you've been listening for a while or if you're new? We really appreciate you going ahead and clicking that subscription button. It really helps us get out in all of those different algorithms and that sort of thing into the hands of more listeners as they're looking for new resources as well. You can also write to us. Let us hear from you from some new ideas that you want to hear in 2022 on the podcast. You can reach us at podcast@worldmethodist.org. Also in today's show notes, you'll find all of our social media connections. Be sure to let us hear from you there as well as by email. Thanks again to Christ Church Memphis for sponsoring this episode. I'm Rob Haynes, and you've been listening to WME's Real Faith, Real World podcast.